This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. Joe Aston is prolific in business, politics and media. Those who know his work will know him from the Australian Financial Review as writer of the column Rear Window. He took that over in 2012 and continued until he gave it up late last year. Rear Window became revered and feared. If you land yourself in that column, it was highly likely it wasn't a good thing. It either meant you were fodder for gossip or one of the most unabating journalists had you in their sights. On Monday, Joe Aston published his first book. It's called The Chairman's Lounge and is the culmination of years of observing, reporting on and researching Qantas, through the pandemic in particular and under the leadership of Alan Joyce. The book, as much of Joe's work, has caused quite a stir. In this conversation, I talk with him about how over the course of the week, he has become enemy number one of our Prime Minister, about power and influence, which really is the overarching theme of the book, and Joe, his work and the man himself. Joe, we chatted last week about this interview. We both agreed that a good chunk of our audience will definitely know who you are. And probably a majority, though, wouldn't have really come across you before.
Lucky them.
Well, this time last week, that was fine. Didn't matter. This book was going to be about Qantas. Now you're kind of part of the story, though.
Yeah, it comes with the territory, I suppose.
For the benefit, and we will get into that news of the week a little bit, how would you describe your style of journalism for the benefit of the audience who don't know you that well?
That's a hard question to answer because, well, my book journalism is fairly conventional investigative journalism, I think, and it's laced with some indignation and humour, but I don't think it's like a lot of the journalism that I did at the Financial Review, and it's part of why I enjoyed doing it so much. I was finally able to go deeply into a subject, and part of writing a daily newspaper column is you're constantly dancing across the top. You know, you might do 800 words on something and you just can't go that deeply into the issues. But the thing about Rear Window, which was the column I used to write in the Financial Review, is it's sort of like partly commentary, partly news, partly satire, partly gossip. So it sort of defies description.
I've heard it described as campaigning journalism.
Yeah, well, that certainly too. And part of the reason why that happened over time, I think, is because of the incentives of a daily columnist. So you have to come up with a sparkling column every day. And when you start with a blank sheet of paper, you have to do all this research, you've got to come up with the material, then you've got to do all the research, talk to all the people. And if you're starting from scratch, it's a lot of work, but which is fine, but also the payoff might not be as much because you're starting from a lower knowledge base. Whereas if you develop into a campaign, you start the day, you know, something new has to happen on the company or the issue that you're campaigning on. But once that happens, you come to it with all of this understanding, previous knowledge. You know exactly who to call straight away. You know which documents to go back to and refer to. So you're giving yourself a leg up straight away. And of course, the incentives of journalism are often to get an outcome. And so that's also part of it as well. If you stay on a subject and you are dogged and you just keep shining that torch in people's faces as they're running away, you're more likely to maybe, get change. Someone might have to resign. A company might have to change the way it does something. A politician might have to change their behaviour. Government policy could change. I don't know.
I really love this quote you gave when asked why you gave up your Rear Window column, which you gave up at the end of last year. It's a little long, bear with me. You really can't write a column like this. I mean, you said it, so you already know it. But for the benefit of everyone listening, you really can't write a column like this unless you have independence. And what I mean is real, terrifying, excruciating independence, where it's really uncomfortable for me, for my bosses, for everyone, but you've just got to do it. As you sort of say, I mean, your work has required, and even when we get to the book, is requiring you to put pressure on people and sort of incessantly until something breaks, until something cracks. You often, I think you've said yourself, you write people's professional obituary sometimes in that regard. What motivates you to do that? Is it the outcome or is it more than that?
The outcome's a part of it, sure. It's a strange profession to explain to anyone. It's high pressure. It's sort of kooky. You don't make many friends doing it. I don't know what I do. I don't know what the motivation is. It's just what you do. I didn't turn up expecting to be some great truth teller as a 28-year-old gossip columnist at the Financial Review. That was not my objective to be Nick McKenzie, and Lord knows I didn't achieve that objective even so. But over time, I think everyone changes the way they do things and they evolve in their job. And if you work for a different sort of employer, you might shift around a big organisation. I was lucky enough just to have Rear Window, the column, and the creative freedom to do with it what I wanted to do. And over time, it just went less from poking fun at people gratuitously and, sharing gossip tidbits to actually moving into really serious analysis. I mean, when I say serious, I still made it humorous, but these were serious issues. Continuing to day after day put pressure on bad behaviour in public office, but also in corporate Australia, where I personally think there's a lot more to work with.
It's interesting because, to your point around, you get to develop this over time, and you start with the one little tidbit of a story, and then it develops. And I guess that's what people mean when they describe campaigning journalism.
Yeah.
But it seems that there is this element to it of the more you know about business, the more there is to talk about.
Definitely.
And is there a part of it that is, this isn't fair, and this is someone needs to write about it? Is there a part of that for you?
Well, I used to write more about politics than I do now, and what I discovered was there's probably a couple of hundred political journalists in Australia or in Canberra, and they're chasing very few stories, but it's a crowded field. In political journalism is a really crowded field, and not only that, but the reaction to the journalism itself is really highly emotional. You write a piece about misconduct, and straight away 50% of the population just wants to attack you for the perception that you're taking one side. The great thing about business journalism is there's this enormous capital market in Australia, and thanks to Paul Keating's superannuation system, there's so much money, the professionalisation of finance in Australia, because there's a huge retirement system. There's all this money swilling around that belongs to Australians, being managed by people, or mismanaged sometimes, and that money has to go somewhere. So it has to go into companies, it has to go into other instruments like bonds and investment schemes, private credit, overseas. And so there's all these people, there's a whole apparatus, there's a whole world behind this, and they are not accustomed to anywhere near as much scrutiny as the political class. And they're also definitely not accustomed to the kind of mockery of their foibles that the political class is very accustomed to. I mean, politicians have had cartoons done them forever,
this is just
right?
part of the political,
Correct.
role. Yeah.
The idea, and sketch columns and the idea that that CEOs or increasingly investment bankers or that they would be mocked in the newspaper is just it was just not taken very well. There's a lot of resistance to there's more reverence of business leaders by business journalists than there is of reverence of political leaders by political journalists. And so that, I think, is partly why my work stood out maybe more than it would have otherwise.
The problem with my next question is I'm going to ask you about politics. I promise, I'm thinking to myself, do I ask him then about Qantas now?
Sure.
But I feel like we do need to address the elephant in the room, which is obviously the point. So we're going to come back to all of that. But the reason why people who didn't know you before will know you now is that, look, Anthony Albanese personally asked for travel upgrades, according to you, when he was Transport Minister. I want to hear in your words what the big problem with that is.
Well, the fact that he held the office in the government that regulates the airline industry makes it particularly difficult. And it's also the idea that the kind of upgrades that Albanese was treated to, these are not sort of like you go to the airport with a neck pillow and your fingers crossed that maybe if you get lucky, there'll be an empty seat and they'll put you in business class or first class. That's not what happened here. These were confirmed upgrades. They were authorised by Alan Joyce. Only Alan Joyce could authorise them. And of course, the reason that it was being part of my book is that the government that he leads made an inexplicable decision in relation to Qatar Airways last year. And there was a lot of commentary, not just from me, about how close Albanese was to Alan Joyce, the previous Qantas CEO, and you know how it was a real blind spot for Albanese that Alan Joyce had become the most hated business person in Australia. Qantas had become one of the most toxic brands in Australia, and Anthony Albanese seemed to be the last to know. And so he also, of course, sought and received a chairman's lounge membership for his son, which is highly irregular. And I wrote that last year at the Financial Review, and Albanese never addressed it, got angry, tried to shut it down, did everything but answer the question. And of course, only this week he's finally confirmed that is actually true. There's also been back and forth, non-denials, then denials from him. And look, I stand by what's in the book. But what I didn't expect was for everyone to simplify this down so much and make this simply about Anthony Albanese and his upgrades 10 or more, almost 15 years ago. I mean, it's in the book for a reason, and it should be in the book. And ironically, part of why he's been targeted is because he has declared it, and people have then I've been able to pull out the documentation to show that he did get upgrades and then get to the bottom of how he got them. But there are plenty of politicians out there who haven't disclosed upgrades, and I now see Bridget McKenzie's in a tangle, having said that she didn't get them, and now it turns out, whoops, she did get much more than she's declared. And that's always how this was going to happen, and which is the point that I was making more, which is this is not just about Albanese's relationship with Qantas. This is about Qantas's influence over the political class, Labor, Liberal, National, everyone, and not just now, over 40 years. And that's, if you read the book, I mean, you pull a section out of the book to promote the book that this happens naturally, but if you look at the entire book, it is about the influence that Qantas has wielded. And people who are quoted in the book, this is just not just from me, but they refer to Qantas as the best lobbyist in Canberra ever.
Yeah, and I mean, just so people, to clarify, Bridget McKenzie is on the opposite side of Parliament to Anthony Albanese, and I think the word you keep using, and I feel like the media keeps using this, is this. It's this conversation about declaration and declaring upgrades, and this keeps going back and forth. And I'm going to leave the tit for tat between Anthony Albanese and all of that here, because the actual point is, politicians can say I declared it, so it's fine.
But is it fine?
Is it fine?
Yeah. No, and I don't think it's fine. And I think the public doesn't, I think the public doesn't think it's fine. Whether or not you declare it, whether or not you seek it, whether or not you get it unintentionally, all of which has happened in different forms at different times. It's just not on.
So it's a pub test question.
Oh, I definitely think so. And it's so prevalent. And it's become so normal, and it's been going on for so long, and it's sort of this entitlement culture that politicians go to Canberra and they just think it's normal, because it has become normal, to get upgraded on when they travel, like it's not a monetary benefit received by a key stakeholder. It just compromises people. And they're in public office and their job is to regulate Qantas. And then they wonder why the public gets the shits when Qantas gets away with murder, which they did during COVID and coming out of COVID.
Which I'm about to ask you about, but I wanted to ask you this one question, and more for the theatre of your answer than anything else. But the accusation that's been thrown back at you by the Prime Minister this week is that you access the lounge yourself, or have in the past, you've had upgrades, but mostly that you're a former Liberal staffer, which you well and truly declared up front in your book, and it's a well-known part of your history. There is a certain portion of the population, though, and there's people I've spoken to outside of our bubble and our political bubble that we're in, saying, but isn't that bloke, isn't he just a Liberal hack and he's just out to get the Prime Minister? Do you pass the pub test?
Look, I don't know. I'm not trying to. I don't care that much, to be honest. That's one of the benefits of working for the Financial Review and writing as a business journalist. Is I sort of have more focus on the relationship with that subscriber base that I used to write for, and they have a sort of assumed level of knowledge which is quite high, and they understand some of the complexities around this. If out there in High Street Campbelltown I'm seen as a political hack, I honestly don't care, which is different for Albanese because he needs people in High Street Campbelltown to vote for him.
You don't need votes.
No,
I
don't.
Votes.
No, and so I understand why he might have tried to do that, to be honest. You got to muddy the waters when you're in strife. It's not based on any facts. Again, I think I was papped having lunch with Peter Dutton early this year, which I suppose plays into the theme that I'm a liberal stooge. But, I mean, journalists have lunch with politicians all the time. As you say, I was a Liberal staffer almost 20 years ago. I worked for Qantas. That's all in the book. It's all part of the story. It's how I know how this works, you know, like that's how I know, because I worked for an MP who was very close to Qantas, Bruce Baird. I was there when private equity came and tried to take Qantas over during the GFC. Then I worked for Qantas and I changed over from, seeing the politicians and how they go for their upgrades to being at Qantas and watching them come for them, or be offered them. It goes both ways, but it's just I've seen this up close, and so I think that's what what you're saying is it brings experience. Well, it makes me an insider in the system. I've seen how the sausage is made.
On that, other things people might be thinking is like this chairman's lounge. You've been in there. Like, how good is it? Because a lot of, just on the surface, this story could potentially seem quite fickle and petty that, politicians are willing or business leaders are willing to go to these extreme lengths to get access to something.
Yeah.
Like, how good is it?
Yeah, it's a good question. It actually isn't that good anymore. It used to be really good. It used to be French champagne unlimited, and it used to be, the restaurant was much more, they spent much more on the catering and all of that kind of thing. It's really, like everything at Qantas, been really cut down. But the thing is, as Qantas understands, it's not even about the champagne or the food. It's about the status, and it's about what you're giving someone is the sense that they're important and that they've made it. It's like saying, how good is a black Amex, which costs you $10,000 a year if you're invited to have one, so that you can pull out a black piece of titanium from your wallet. These are in the old days when you had cards, and you put it down and people say, she's a big deal, right? He has made it.
Comment on people's character then, like our leader's character.
It's their status anxiety, but which is what the whole frequent flyer program is built on. So it starts at the top with the Chairman's Lounge, but it goes right down to gold frequent flyers who are just desperate to get access to the Qantas Club, which is by all accounts an absolute dump. But, that's people aspire and they take flights that they don't even need to fly each year just to re-qualify as a Qantas Gold. Because so that I'm a member of the Qantas Club. I
think you actually talk about that really cleverly in your book, that this is about power and influence over our politicians, the business world, but also the public. And I have some questions on that later. Moving through the book on that influence point, I think it well articulates how Qantas sort of went from exploiting that power, I guess, sort of marinating in it is probably how I would describe it. Like they kind of just enjoyed it for a while. The primary focus being on Alan Joyce and the way he changed over his tenure as 15 years as CEO. He sort of ate himself alive in the end, I guess, is what you're saying. Decimated the Qantas brand in the meantime, possibly. I think that's evidenced
that's what
now.
I'm saying, and that's proof. There's proof of that. Yeah.
There's a couple of really key things that you point out, and that I think that some people might have forgotten about. Well, maybe not. The flight credits and the ghost flight scheme. The numbers that you pull on that, and that you sort of tell the story of those, are quite staggering. Like, are they burnt into your brain, those numbers?
Some of them. Well, they're two different things. So the first thing is, of course, the COVID credits, and that starts in March 2020. And the mass cancellation of flights when the borders close and we all get stuck at home for the first part of COVID. Qantas takes all of the ticket bookings, all of our bookings, and moves them into credits and sends us these credits. When in actual fact, we're all legally entitled under the conditions of carriage, which is the contract we have as with the airline, to a cash refund. So not only do they not give us our cash refunds, they don't tell us that we're entitled to cash refunds. Or in the times where they hint that maybe we're entitled to it, it's all very oblique. And if you try and call them to find out anything more, of course, you can't get through because they've stood everyone down, and the phone wait times are hours long. And then, of course, they keep that money as working capital to survive. And then over the next 2 to 3 years, people become more and more infuriated as they attempt again and again and again to get their money back or to redeem a flight, often by which time, you know, the $400 flight that they booked and got credit for is now $1,200. The thing is, in 2022, when everything went wrong, and there's sort of a side story of why it all went wrong, but when everything went wrong, you know, when the lost bags, the late flights, the cancellations, the call centres that no one was where no one was answering, cutting you off, the COVID credits were a big part of that, and people finally were going, okay, we can travel again. I want to use these credits that I'm owed. I want to use my money, yeah. And no one will answer the phone. I can't find the credit. I can't use it for a fare that's, you know, not higher than the one I booked before. I call up to get they get cut off. I have to start again. They say that the credit's they don't have a record of the credit. It just went on. And the thing is, when something is made that difficult, it's obviously the case that people will wonder, is it being made this difficult on purpose?
What I'm always thinking about in this context is, what were they thinking? What's Alan Joyce thinking at this point? Well, he's got a justification for this.
Well, his justification is very often, this is what everyone's doing. You know, and that was a lot of Qantas' excuses were always, the whole global airline industry is doing this, which is, you know, what I used to say, you know, when I hit my brother, you know. So
everyone else is doing it. You do have an anecdote, though, about Rex Airlines in the book where they actually had an exchange. John Sharp, who was leading that airline at the time, was saying to Alan Joyce, you know what, I'm not doing it this way. Why are you doing it this way? So there's... Is that you know, where's those justifications coming from?
Yeah, well, I didn't say that it made sense. I was just telling you that that's what Alan Joyce would have been saying at the time. But what their incentives were, I mean, I can't verbal Alan Joyce or Vanessa Hudson, but what their incentives was to keep that money from being redeemed, or if they couldn't, to get people to burn the money, but on flights that were twice the price. You know, so they effectively got to keep the money and then get paid again. And even better, if they could keep the money from being redeemed, they could force the credits to expire and then basically confiscate the money perfectly. And that's what they were close to doing last year when I was really going at them, like day after day, saying this scheme is a scheme to legally steal more than $500 million from Australian customers. And they really, they were trying to really play that down about how much they owed, when it was expiring, what was the balance of credits owed. And that led me to write a series of columns that were then picked up by a Senate inquiry. And there was quite an explosive exchange where Alan Joyce was Qantas executives with Alan Joyce were forced to admit that they had a lot more money in COVID credits than they had been saying publicly. And then the ACCC came out and sued them for the ghost flights and said as well, it is not acceptable that you're going to make these credits expire. And Qantas had to back down and not take the money.
Ghost flights being those flights that were never intended to fly, that you could book on.
They were.
Or you couldn't book on. You could book them, but you were never going to take them.
But they'd already been cancelled. You could book tickets on these flights and they'd already been cancelled.
There's a great quote in the book that I really loved. It actually, I was reading it and I was like, I laughed out loud, but it speaks to all of these issues at once, but also this like sort of cascading brand damage that was being done. Qantas management did not appear to comprehend the diabolical risk to their brand of robbing their customers blind, then as an added bonus, showing them the worst time of their lives. It kind of sums it up.
Thank you. Well, that's what I was going for.
There's also then, of course, the illegal sacking of workers, and that's been well and truly proven. There's Joyce's own goal when he blamed passengers. People might remember this for not being travel fit.
Yeah, not being match fit.
That's right, not being match fit. That was when we did return to flying and we were all terrible at passing through the airport. Then there, I think, for a lot of people, there's this overarching sort of jaw-dropping number of how much Alan Joyce earned and was set to earn. Talk to that a little bit.
So, over his 15-year tenure, he earned more than $120 million. And that is more than even the CEOs of the big four banks make, if you break it down to a yearly rate. And bearing in mind that the big four banks are 10, 15, and in some cases even 20 times the size of Qantas. So it's an extraordinary, I would say, excessive amount of money. Part of the reason why it was so high is because a lot of it was share-based pay. So he got a lot of the money in 2014, 15, 12, 13, 14, 15, when the share price was bumping along the bottom of the ground at $1 per share. And he then got the share price up to $7. And so that led his pay to explode. And of course, then the share price collapsed again during COVID. He was issued all these shares when the share price was really low during COVID. And then he was then pushing so hard for Qantas to become super profitable coming out of COVID. And that was driving the share price up. And then, of course, led to him almost getting paid $24 million in his last year. Of course, the board ultimately
decided not to do that. But I mean, regardless, $24 million in $120 million in millions and to people listening.
These numbers are a little bit beyond our comprehension.
They're beyond our comprehension. I mean, his defenders might say, well, he just did a great job of running the company and that's what he should do. And I mean, I guess this is the actual nub of the question.
Yeah. Well, I agree. And the thing is, was he talented? Incredibly. Was he very good at what he did at certain times for certain periods? Absolutely. I think the real issue is towards the end where he was getting paid. The thing that really sticks in my craw is that he was getting paid bonuses, long-term bonuses worth millions of dollars in the 3 years where Qantas lost $6 billion, 2020, 2021, 2022. He got paid. He qualified for these long-term bonuses, and then he would say each year, "I'm just going to set those aside. I'm not going to take them. We'll talk about it next year." And he did that for 3 years, and then they came out of COVID. And bearing in mind that in those years where he got those bonuses for, all of Qantas' staff were either stood down without pay or on JobKeeper, or they were subject to a pay freeze, and they certainly weren't getting bonuses. And then he comes out of COVID and says, yep, I'll get a big whacking bonus for 2023, but on top of that, I'll just go back and I'll take all those bonuses that I set aside as well. And he was questioned about this in the Senate committee and said, how is it that you think you can take your bonuses from the years where Qantas lost all this money? And he said, well, that's not true, Senator. He just denied it, which, again, there were these key moments where I saw Alan Joyce was so self-blind that he almost distorted reality to think that things weren't really happening in order to justify them.
The way, and this is, I mean, to the character point, it is such an interesting theme, not just for Alan Joyce in this book, but a number of people. Just to paraphrase you, you've described him as needing to have the last say. That was a really key thing about him. His need to dominate the narrative.
The first and the last.
First and the last. The need to dominate the narrative, like control the story, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. Do you see this a lot, though?
Yeah, absolutely.
And,
yes.
And why is it? Why? And I mean, you put a fair bit of blame on the board not holding him to account on this. Do you think they have a lot of control over that aspect of it, though?
Well, they are his boss, so they have total control. If they choose to exercise
professionally,
it.
yes.
Yes. So there's two questions there. The first one about how does this happen or why does this happen? I mean, the fact is, and I've included some of this analysis in the book, and I've talked about this widely, is that power affects people cognitively over time. It acts much like having a traumatic brain injury is what power does to you. It makes you more impulsive, less risk aware, less able to see things from other people's point of view. And so over time, if you have a high social or professional status position, and there are almost none as high as being the CEO of Qantas, it affects your judgment. You become very badly impaired. And that will happen to anyone. And that's why you should never be the CEO of a big company or hold public office for 15 years. That's too long because it's been a long time since you've lived in the real world. It doesn't feel like it to someone who's the CEO of a big company that they're not living in the real world, but they're not, because everyone around them relies on them for their ongoing tenure. If you're the CEO, all of your direct reports, they're not equals. They're not going to talk to you like an equal. They're not going to give you honest feedback when they're afraid to, which is always. And equally out there in the community, people want things from you because you're powerful, and so they're going to constantly be giving you, reinforcing your views back to you, which is why, again, getting back to the second part of the question, the board's role is so important because they are your superiors. A director of the Qantas board is Alan Joyce's superior, supposed to be, who says you're talking smack. What, like
you're wrong.
You're wrong.
And this is where you get to in the book, and this is where the extra. If anyone read the papers last weekend, I think like the majority of those extracts were about Richard Goyder.
In the AFR extract was very much about him.
The AFR extract was, I think, so I want to ask you about that because Richard Goyder, you talk about Alan Joyce's character very differently to how you talk about Richard Goyder's character. For people who don't know Richard Goyder, he's been chair of a number of things. He's a very powerful person, a very influential person. He was the chairman of Qantas at the time.
And he's still the chairman of the AFL.
Still the chairman of the AFL.
And Woodside Energy, a big Perth oil and gas company.
Formerly Wesfarmers.
He was the CEO of Wesfarmers, which of course at the time owned Coles, Bunnings, now owns Priceline, and
So he's the person you suggested should have been the person holding Alan Joyce to account. He's his boss. He's his superior. You say very clearly that he's lost touch, that he lost touch with regular people and he's not a regular person and that was his problem. But his character, you talk about as he's a really nice guy. How did this happen? Mm-hmm. So you can lose touch, lose judgment without becoming a bad person.
Sure.
Is that a difference?
I'm careful about saying a bad person because, I mean, that's very a simplification. Like, is Alan Joyce a bad person? I don't think I've ever said that.
No,
deeply flawed person, but, aren't we all? But, of course, not all of us are the CEO of Qantas or the chairman of Qantas. Sorry if I'm being nitpicky, but I
think that's actually a really good point. Yeah. I think it's a really fair point. It's just... I just think it is interesting the way you talk about them too differently. You're quite torn about Richard Goyder.
I am and I'm not. As in, I mean, he deserves what I wrote about him. That's my strongly held view, and I'm sad about it. I know I did use the word torn in there. There was a point at which I was torn, but I have certainly come to peace with the fact that as nice as Richard is, he did not do his job properly, and nor did his colleagues. You know, again, Richard's just one member of the Qantas board. He is chairman, so his responsibility is elevated, but he's got a whole board of directors who sat there and allowed Qantas to become the most hated major brand in Australia, and did very little about it. And that's hard to defend. I mean, I looked for a counterfactual on that, but it's just not really there.
The other thing, and this is particularly because we're on a podcast called News Club and this is about the news, is the point where you remind people that when you were going really hard on Alan Joyce and Qantas, and this is just a tiny example, but the AFR started disappearing from lounges around Australia.
Well, it wasn't sort of like it formally disappeared, as in Qantas removed it.
Actively. Or you started to hear reports that, things were, going away.
Yeah, the feedback started to come in.
And this isn't the first time they've done something like this. They've pulled advertising, in fact, before.
Yeah, 10 years earlier, Alan Joyce was very upset at Adele Ferguson, who was then at the Sydney Morning Herald, and Alan had just delivered a $4 billion loss. It's still the record loss for Qantas, even after the COVID years. And Adele wrote on the front page of the paper that he should resign. And he had been CEO for 6 years, and he'd financially the company was doing very poorly. Some of that was his fault, some of it wasn't. But it was not, I don't think it was, put it this way, it was not a really out there call. I mean, it was pretty reasonable given the circumstances. Anyway, Joyce would not hear about it and had a massive reaction and, cancelled all of Qantas's advertising in Fairfax newspapers, pulled the newspapers out of the airport terminals, because remember back in those days there were big stacks of them at the gate when you got on a plane, and ended all the commercial relationship with Fairfax at the time, even though they actually, ironically, remained very close to the AFR at the time because the AFR was still quite supportive of Joyce. So Joyce had form when it came to trying to shut down criticism and not being able to process alternative points of view about his performance.
Joe, how does Qantas brand recover from this is something I'm interested in. And does it matter? Because we're getting back to the earlier point you made about how many of us are frequent flyers. How many of us are frequent flyers?
16 million.
16
Qantas
million
frequent flyers.
Qantas frequent flyers in Australia.
Mm-hmm. They're not all active members, but it's a huge number.
So there's that. So we're all part of this, I guess, influence machine if you want to go that extreme.
Yeah.
But often also there's no other option.
Certainly it's on certain regional routes and the kind of thing. And if you live in the country and you happen to be on a Qantas-linked monopoly route, you are being reamed.
So how how much does the brand need to recover to still be making profit, to still be a successful business?
Well, it doesn't need to. It's still making very good profits, and its brand is still in the toilet, which says a lot. The brand will take time to recover, but as you point out with the frequent flyer program, the penetration is so deep, and people are so. The thing is, particularly the active members of the frequent flyer program, they have this thing called sunk cost theory, where we've already put so much into something that you then won't let it go, even though it would be actually better off for you to, because I've got all these points and I've been bronze for this many years, and this is just all how my life works, and I always do it this way. I can't change now, and so that the friction of it's almost
kind of like moving from a
Apple
Mac to Apple,
like you're kind of
moving
to like a Google phone to from the Apple services. I've got to change to Spotify, and it's just forget it. It'll never happen. So Qantas knows this, and so they know they have to improve things, but they also know that they don't really have to improve things that much, because no matter how poorly they treat us, a lot of us will just keep coming back no matter what, for a lack of competition, but also because we are trapped in our abusive relationship with them.
I asked you earlier, I touched on it, but I want to ask the very direct question. I assume right now Alan Joyce, his supporters, many people at Qantas really disagree with a lot of what the book says, as much as they can, in what's true and what's not, and what's sort of maybe less proven or more proven, or just maybe how they're coming at it. What conversations do you think they're having?
Well, I'm not in a position to obviously answer that accurately, but I tried to talk to Alan Joyce. He wouldn't participate in the book, and tried to do the same with Richard Goyder, who also wouldn't talk to me. But I did talk extensively to Qantas and to senior Qantas executives, and they answered dozens and dozens of questions. And so a lot of that research where there's a lot of numbers, all of that's been checked with them. And we had long, long meetings where we argued the point. And we didn't, obviously, they would not necessarily agree with how I rendered all of those facts to make my argument. But they read the book, and they have not said, well, this is completely wrong. Maybe they've decided if they think that, they won't bother telling me. I don't know. But I would just say that Qantas cooperated extensively with my book, which was definitely a change in approach to the way they dealt with the media and the way they dealt with their critics to when Alan was there, when simply you'd just be dismissed. There would just be no good faith process of engagement.
The back end of the book and the last chapter talks a lot about the future and future leadership, and I'll leave people to read it. I want to ask you about corporate Australia more broadly. Is there a corporate leader you really respect? Is there someone that you look at and you go, they're doing this really well?
That's a hard one. I'm better at saying who I don't respect, as you probably noticed. Look, the thing is, I really rate John Mullen, who's the new chairman of Qantas, and he goes against the grain and he speaks his mind, and he's, I think, culturally a pretty good person for the company. But there are other really good leaders out there. I think Matt Common at the Commonwealth Bank is a really high-quality executive. And, BHP is a very well-run company. Ken McKenzie's a terrific chairman. He's getting ready to leave now. And Mike Henry's a very thoughtful leader as well. And then you look at some of the great entrepreneurs out there, and like Ryan Stokes, who runs the Seven Group, is a seriously good executive, and sort of unusually, that second generation billionaire families where things don't always go as well in the second generation. He is proving otherwise. He's done an incredible job. It's much more boring and less sexy running cement companies and sort of tractor companies instead of media companies, but he's done very well, and I bet his father's very, very pleased with that. And then even people like Andrew Forrest, who right out there on the wacko fringes, but what he's achieved, even though I tease him for being mad, what he has achieved is quite incredible. Like, to take on the giants of mining in Western Australia and start and turn Fortescue into a genuine third player. Like, just having, when the last business he'd run had gone bankrupt, he still managed to get the funding out of people. He could sell anything, that guy. So, like, the thing I love about writing about powerful people in Australia is they're really fascinating people. Like, they're not stupid, obviously, and they're really complex and they're really flawed. And there's a lot of nuance involved in writing about them. And I think the great thing about writing a book is you can include more nuance. I think it's more entertaining, to be honest, than politicians who I think quite often can be quite cardboard cutout like these days.
I thought about this when I was watching Lee Sales' show, The Assembly. And I don't know if you watched any of it, and I know lots of people listening have watched it, but Anthony Albanese's episode was by far the worst.
Yeah.
Because politicians, it's just so hard to get
Relax
them to relax
and
and be
genuine,
normal. And
yeah.
it's not that's not a slight on Anthony Albanese. It's just that the other ones
Yeah.
were so much more
Yeah,
interesting.
totally.
For all the good ones, and it doesn't mean these people aren't in your sights at some point or another. There's obviously the ones that, you have held to account. And I wish we had time to go through some of your other great stories, but we don't. If someone is in your sights, Joe, what is your advice to them?
Why would I give you that? Why would I answer that question and give you the secret sauce?
Because people want to know.
It's interesting because
how do I deal with this?
There is a cottage industry out there of people who get paid very highly in the PR profession to try and solve people's Joe Aston problems. Obviously, it's shrunk considerably since I left the AFR, but and some people have this attitude: you've just got to take him out for lunch and and become friendly and charm him and I think that works if the person is high quality and authentic and has a plausible story to explain the issues that they're in. But there's also, if the person is shifty and if there are circumstances where you actually should probably keep the person away from me.
Interesting.
And that has certainly happened where, the PR person said, we'll go out for lunch and that will solve everything. And I've gone away and gone, that person is as much of a fraud as I thought.
That was worse.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I know that's not an answer, but it's some colour.
It's some colour. Thank you for that. I want to finish on you, if that's okay. I know you love talking about yourself. I know you prefer to talk about Qantas, and I know you don't like talking about yourself, but I do want to finish on you. You gave up alcohol 5.5 years ago. You mentioned in deciding to do that, when I listened back to you talk about that one of the things that really frightened you was losing your mind, losing your intellect. Clearly, this work that you do is very important to you.
Yeah, well, it's not sort of like digging trenches in the rain. It's not just something where I hang my hat up at the end of the day and then leave it over there. It's sort of part of who I am, and I think as a writer and a journalist, if you really love it and it's part of your identity, it shows. That's probably why I'll find it so hard to let go of. But not that I'm proposing to, but no one wants to lose their mind though. And no one wants to, deteriorate physically or mentally at a really young age. It was a lot of fun while it lasted, but life's a lot better now.
And this is the interesting thing to me. I didn't know you when you were a drinker. I've only known you sober, but it is interesting to me that it doesn't, there are some creative people where giving up that sort of thing changes the way they do their work, and whether they can do it or not is actually quite scary to them. I read something where you said that resisting alcohol was almost the easiest part, at least in the early stages, but actually learning to re-engage with people. And because your job is all about engaging people and talking to people and getting information out of people, you said that was the hardest thing to relearn. Doesn't seem like it has affected your work in the way that you might have been scared it would have.
Well, it took time, and that process is now through. So, but in the first year it was very hard. I didn't work very much in 2019. I took a lot of time off. I was very lucky that the AFR and it was Channel 9 by that point, gave me a lot of time off to get well. It's just a different way of doing things. I started in journalism approaching it with the idea that I'll go out to... Well, actually, it was sort of what attracted me to journalism.
Long lunches.
Yeah, you can go out
It
and
is
get drunk
appealing,
and get secrets out of people and then stumble back to the office and write something in 2 hours and go home and drink more. But so it was really like the drinking was my job and the actual producing the journalism was just the thing that I had to do to keep it going. You then turn it around, and if you go from drinking all day and doing 2 or 3 hours work to not drinking at all and doing 10 hours work, the quality of your work, surprise, surprise, improves quite drastically. And I think that's the experience. Objectively, my work has improved a lot.
No, I absolutely think so. As someone who's followed you for a really long time, that is very, very clear. And I think that's the consensus among most people who know you well. 2 more questions before we finish. There was a joke made at your book launch. I think it might have been even your publisher got up and made a jibe. I think it was. I would put it as to say, welcome all of Joe's sources to this event. And I'm sure you've had that joke made before. Mm-hmm. How do you pick your friends?
Oh, geez, that's a tricky question. I don't think. Do you pick your friends? Look, I have always.
I feel like you probably have to. I guess.
In my life, I have always sought out the smartest people because I find them interesting and I enjoy their company. And I always, I learned very quickly that surrounding myself with the smartest people made me smarter, and that's often how it's done. I go, you are seriously funny, you are seriously smart, you're going to be my friend. So I guess you do pick your friends now that I admit to it. But was that what you were asking, or you were asking how I manage?
Well, I guess my final question is, does friendship mean loyalty?
The thing is, in the journalism profession, you do have to have a professional relationship and a personal relationship, and you have to be really clear with people about where the boundary is. That's complicated sometimes, and it's a hard profession emotionally sometimes, because to be a good journalist, you really can't want or need to be popular or loved. It's okay if you aspire to be respected, but if you are, sort of leaving this part out because you don't want that person to hate you, or these people, this cohort of people to hate you, then you're doing a disservice to your readers. So you're in the wrong profession, or you need to learn to behave differently. And that's what I did. I mean, I was in the wrong profession because I was so conflict avoidant for a long time. And what I needed to do was learn how to do conflict, and how to be really proactive and have upfront conversations with people about and base my conversations not on personalities but on issues. And if you're really clear about that, then you can sleep at night. Very well.
Some
mostly.
nights.
Yeah, mostly.
Joe Aston, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks for listening. For more interviews like this one, search for News Club in your podcast app and hit follow.